Our final guest this evening is William Shunn, a Hugo and Nebula nominated writer who has lived in every time zone in the continental U.S. His memoir, The Accidental Terrorist, was shortlisted this year for the Association of Mormon Letters Award, despite the stance it takes on the LDS faith. His storytelling has been featured at the legendary Throckmorton Theater in California, at Up Comedy Club in Chicago, and at the Pitt Main Stage in New York City. A former co-host of Tuesday Funk, he currently hosts and produces the quarterly Line Break reading series in Queens, which will become monthly starting in February. Ask him for more information after the show if you're going to be in New York next year. He regularly accepts monetary payments from a giant corporate interest. Visit him online at shunn.net or at @shunn, that's 2 N's, and give him a warm welcome back to Tuesday Funk.
I've kept feeling all night like I need to jump up here and adjust the microphone for everybody. It's just what I'm used to doing. I have to thank people also. I've got to thank Connor and Reinhardt for starting Tuesday Funk, and Hallie as well, but especially for inviting me to read. I don't even remember how many years ago that was, but I read for the first time at the 12th episode of Tuesday Funk. So I wasn't there at the beginning, but I got in there, and eventually Hallie asked me to take over for her when she was moving on, and I got to work with Sarah, and I'm just amazed at the way the series has carried on after we both left. It's amazing, and Andrew and Eden have been doing a fantastic job. And I couldn't be happier about that. And to see so many people here. At that first Tuesday Funk reading that I was at, I read from my memoir, which I was working on at the time, The Accidental Terrorist, accidentalterrorist.com. And I continued, I appeared a few more times and kept reading sections from that memoir, and that's what I thought I was going to do tonight. And then, recent developments in the political landscape made me think maybe I should read this old story of mine that I wrote more than 25 years ago. This was my first published short story. It appeared in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in February 1993. And I'm not going to read the whole story. I'm actually going to start in the middle and read mostly through to the end. But I think you'll be able to catch on pretty readily. The main action of the story takes place way in the future of 1993 at the presidential inauguration of 2009. And there's 4 main characters. They're 10-year-old boys who attend a boarding school or live at a boarding school in New Hampshire. But they are Benny, Charlie, Huey, and Slapjack, who's a giggly little fuck. And they're there with the school's choir and their choir master, Mr. Kemmelman, to sing at the presidential inauguration. And so it was that oh, by the way, this is Benny narrating the story. And so it was that Inauguration Day found our choir crammed onto a set of irregular risers that seemed designed more to conform to the side of Capitol Hill than to accommodate a group of performers. We were forced to rearrange ourselves as we tried to find places to sit, and Charlie and I and several others ended up displaced from our accustomed center section. In fact, a great number of us were shifted into new positions, which only made us feel out of place and increased our anxiety. Mr. Kemmelman continued to pace, which did not help. Chief Justice Souter closed his remarks and asked John Isaiah Wheelock to rise. As the president-elect approached the dais, the vast crowd seemed to swell, like a tide groping for the moon. I find myself wondering today where all the protesters were, where the signs and the placards and the indignant voices had taken refuge. They had turned out in force for Phyllis Whiteley's inauguration. Why was no one protesting this? Mr. Kemmelman had once been a protester. as I have learned from various sources at the Hawthorne Academy. He once led faculty opposition to many of the policies of the Board of Trustees, and when most of the board had wanted him terminated, it was Jack Wheelock who had saved him. Wheelock had persuaded the board that it was better to grant the faculty a few concessions than to risk creating a martyr. Now Mr. Kemmelman was a player in Wheelock's inauguration, about to demonstrate to the nation the depths of his support for the new president. This is what becomes of protesters in the new America. A way is found to turn them. The lucky ones, that is. All the October polls had showed Wheelock behind. According to the media, there was no way he could win.
What the hell, Bill?
But then he did. Oh, it's my fault now. But then he did win, decisively. He found the support he needed when he needed it in places no one else had thought to look. And this leads me to a heretical thought. Perhaps the framers of the Constitution were more correct than we would care to admit when they designed the Electoral College to keep power away from the people. I can't get everything right. John Isaiah Wheelock stood before the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court like a mooring post for our eyes and expectations. Remote hollow cameras from the major cable companies drifted in loose ranks about the presidential grandstand like a flock of hovering raptors. Mr. Kemmelman readied his baton, his face a study in severe control, and we felt a thrill of adrenaline. The downbeat would come the moment our new president completed his oath of office. Jack Wheelock raised his right arm. I should have been concentrating on Mr. Kemmelman, on finding my center, on grounding myself for our performance, but instead my eyes were locked on Wheelock, on his right arm, bent at the elbow like a carpenter's square to form a perfect 90-degree angle. A right angle, his right arm. I was 10 years old. I was only beginning to grasp the significance of left and right. The clear, deliberate voice of the Chief Justice split the air. I, repeat your name, do solemnly affirm. The words startled me, rolling over the crowd like a blast of thunder. I, John Isaiah Wheelock, do solemnly affirm, repeated the president-elect. A constrictive panic rose in my chest. Mr. Kemmelman was poised as menacingly and impassively as a stone gargoyle. Charlie and all the other boys around me, none of us in our proper familiar places, seemed to press in on me like the crush of hot bodies in a gas chamber. I scanned every face I could see, but all seemed unconcerned, oblivious. Looking back, I wonder who might have spoken out that day had our choir not done so. That I will faithfully execute, that I will faithfully execute. These were the terrifying voices of twin titans. The president-elect had always been quick to point out his direct descent from Eleazar Wheelock, the Congregationalist minister who founded Dartmouth College. The Wheelocks, Jack claimed, and by extension himself, were part of the warp and woof of American history, part of the nation's destiny. What he failed to mention, however, was that the original Wheelock had resorted to fraud in order to attract funding for Dartmouth. He claimed the new school was meant to educate the local Indians, when in reality he only intended it to produce more Congregationalist ministers. There is nothing new under the sun. The office of President of the United States, the office of President of the United States. Wheelock claimed his party would restore America's moral and patriotic fiber, reestablish her as the world leader in commerce and industry. But what we have now is a quiet, pervasive police state, a great octopus with its tentacles strangling every one of our rights. Our courts and legislatures are engaged in a slow dismantling of the Constitution. With each successive Congress, our freedoms are whittled away as surely as small knives can in time reduce a 2x4 to toothpicks. And will to the best of my ability, analysts now call Jack Wheelock's election to the presidency reactionary in nature. Democrats had been in power for 12 years, both in the White House and on Capitol Hill. The country was no better for it. We were ready for a savior. But the ensuing mad dash to conservatism left our country tilting farther to the right than it had ever tilted before. Protect, preserve, and defend. Protect, preserve, and defend. Was it only my fevered imagination, or was that a trace of distaste on the Chief Justice's face? Did Souter perhaps foresee what was to come, and was he sick with despair at setting that evil machinery into motion? The Constitution of the United States, so help me God. Mr. Kimmelman came to life, like an iceberg flash thawed. The section on the right will begin, he hissed. On the right. Ready? Jack Wheelock's voice rang out with the finality of a death knell. The Constitution of the United States, so help me God. I wanted to scream. But there, in the split second of silence before cheering and wild applause could erupt, flashed Mr. Kimmelman's baton, insistent as an ice pick, signaling the onset of the magnificent cannon he had crafted from the strains of God Bless America. And the downbeat fell, precise as surgical steel. Some of us opened our mouths. Some of us did not. Some of us, managed to croak out a ragged opening note before glancing around in sick confusion and falling silent. A funereal stillness ensued. We faced an audience of 1,000,000 staring corpses. Cold hands squeezed my heart. But things still might have turned out all right if not for what happened next. It was something any other president could have shrugged off, forgiven of 100 or so small boys. Ronald Reagan, a product of the entertainment industry, would have understood. I'm sure either one of the Roosevelts would have just smiled and signaled for us to have another go at it, chomping on a thick cigar or clenching a thin cigarette holder between gleaming teeth. I can picture Abraham Lincoln patting each one of us on the head, unbearable depths of sympathy in his sad, dark eyes. We would all have been changed men had Lincoln been with us. But this was John Isaiah Wheelock. To him, we were not small boys. We were mere symbols in his thrall. Now President of the United States, Wheelock glared at us in that interminable moment with eyes that burned like an angry demon's. The crowd, the cameras, the Secret Service cordon, all seemed to vanish like smoke the way dreams flee at the cold touch of reality. The world had narrowed down to just us and our president, a pitiful army of children facing a modern Goliath. Mr. Kimmelman seemed to me suddenly a fragile marionette suspended between warring puppeteers. He looked old and very brittle. Only a few seconds passed in that horrible silence, but it felt like eternity, a soundless free-fall through ice. Someone began to laugh, and the free-fall ended with a sickening jolt. I spat the only word I could find. Shit. It was Slapjack, God keep his soul, defending us against the president's baleful anger the only way he knew how, with the only weapon he owned for warding off what he did not understand. His was not merry laughter, not delighted laughter, not the laughter of relief, but rather terrified, hysterical laughter, too shrill by several degrees to be mistaken for an outpouring of joy or mirth. It clawed its way into the still air like some ferocious infant dragon, ripping itself free of the birth canal and fighting to gain a purchase on the sky with its still moist wings. Slapjack's eyes were wide, as if he were helpless to quell that ghastly sound. And we, his classmates, laughed along with him. A few nervous titters broke out at first, but those quickly expanded into full-throated gales, and in a few moments we were holding our sides, writhing in our seats like a bunch of weak-kneed kindergartners, tears streaming down our faces. It wasn't at all funny. There was not one blasted funny thing about the entire situation. We were honored guests at the presidential inauguration, and we had just blown our golden moment in the spotlight before the most powerful men in the country, before foreign dignitaries, before a gathered crowd of thousands and thousands, before the disbelieving eyes and ears of millions of Americans, before the microphones and cameras of the entire world. So what else was there to do but laugh? Laugh like raving lunatics. Our laughter multiplied and echoed back from the floating loudspeakers, from the mausoleum white marble of the Capitol, from the monuments all down the mall, as if a horde of demons were descending on the city. Mr. Kimmelman stood frozen, arms still raised, with the faintly surprised air of a man just impaled on a spear. His eyes betrayed only disbelief. Then the laughter spread to the crowd. I will not attempt to describe any more of it here. Every news outlet in the country has tape of it in three-dimensional surround. The only way to know how it really felt is to have been there in person, but the tapes come close. I know, I've reviewed them often enough. Chaos reigned for a minute or two, but after a few stern words from Chief Justice Souter, order was restored. We were even given a chance to try our number again, and we did a respectable job of it. It didn't make us feel any better, though. We had already upstaged ourselves, and no performance, no matter how good, could make up for that. But we had also upstaged the President of the United States. After that first horrible instant, he had managed to mask his true emotions, but we weren't fooled. He smiled graciously as we pushed through our number, but from that small smile shone malice as pure as beams of black light. We had laughed at his inauguration, and from his point of view, I'm sure he felt we were laughing at him. But time marches on, as inexorably as the parade which soon installed Jack Wheelock in his new home at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. 12 years have passed, and he has been laughing at the rest of us ever since. My parents eke out a meager subsistence back home in Maine, two old reporters whose suddenly liberal press was forced into closure nearly a decade ago. Charlie's father, once a critic of military rearmament, has not been heard from in 7 years. Huey's mother is dead, killed in religious violence in the streets of New York City. His family had never been practicing Jews, but strangely enough, now they are, covertly. The source of the laughter is dead as well. In his first year at Harvard, the Black Depression, which had been creeping over Slapjack for years, at last reached its high tide. I suspect it was Charlie who sold him the gun, from his missing father's collection, perhaps, though I'm sure Charlie supposed it was intended for a very different purpose. We left Washington that day in 3 chartered buses bound straight for North Andeline, New Hampshire. Mr. Kimmelman stayed on, supposedly to attend the inaugural ball as a special guest of the president. None of us ever saw him again. We finished out the term with a substitute teacher, and by early spring, a full-time replacement had been named. No one offered us an explanation. When I think of Mr. Kimmelman now, I try to remember the stern, generous man who strove to embrace us all that day back in our choral chamber, but whose arms turned out to be too short. I try to remember him that way, but all too often what I see is his heavy, slightly stunned face congealing into horror as our laughter rolls past him in ugly waves. And then I realize, once more but never with any less force, that it was we children, we small boys, who laughed him into non-existence. I am back in Washington today, Wednesday, January 20th, 2021. The occasion is Jack Wheelock's 4th inauguration. I attend Dartmouth, and I've begun my student teaching at the Nathaniel Hawthorne Memorial Boys Academy. By a peculiar twist of fate, I've drawn the same duty forced upon Mr. Kimmelman some 12 long years ago. My boys are here with me, crowded onto ill-sized risers adjoining the presidential grandstand. The day is again cold and clear. President Wheelock has waited all this time for our choir to reattain its former level of excellence, and he is determined that we serve him today with fierce allegiance, as if that will undo the affront of so long ago. Charlie and Huey are here somewhere also, perhaps as part of the crowd, perhaps atop one of the nearby buildings, or perhaps in some cunning disguise inside the security cordon. I prefer not to know where. For their part, they are determined that Jack Wheelock not be allowed to serve a 4th term. For my part, I am determined only to draw from my boys the most haunting and plaintive music that has ever been heard in this city, which was once the cradle of democracy. I am determined to give Mr. Kimmelman, wherever he is, the performance we failed to deliver that Tuesday in '09. Everyone will be waiting for another colossal blunder, They will be waiting for us to disgrace ourselves again, to humiliate our president, but we will not. We will sing like angels, and we will seize the minds and souls of all within the sound of our voices. They will hear, see, and feel nothing else but our music. And when the shots ring out to signal the end of an era, we will not miss a beat, and the strains of Horace Kemmelman's magnificent arrangement of God Bless America will wash out over the mall like a cool breeze from heaven. It may be the last song I ever hear, but my boys will make me proud, and I will be happy. There is something my parents never understood about America. It is that America only understands itself. It knows little of anything else, and what it does know, it comprehends poorly. My parents named me Benedict, from the Latin for good word, or good saying, or even good voice, for they hoped I might someday write or speak with a powerful voice in defense of all that is good about this nation. But they made a mistake. In this country, even among those who know nothing else of American history, the name Benedict is associated with one thing only: treason. And perhaps a traitor is what I am. Perhaps that's what we all are. Who of you can blame us, though, for a certain amount of confusion that dark day 12 years ago? With the crowd, the cameras, the very weight of history hanging over our heads like some giant Damoclean sword, who can blame us for one small and treacherous mistake? All it boiled down to was a breakdown of communication. Charlie and I, and many of the others, were used to sitting in the center section of the choir. When Mr. Kemmelman asked that the section to his right begin the canon, he was forgetting that many of us had shifted positions, and that from our point of view, we had moved to the left. Thank you.